Rounding out the letters or writings of John, we have the book of Revelation. Now, Revelation there's a lot to say about that, and we don't have, that could take up an entire course by itself. So let me just give you a little bit of background, a little bit of just some things by way of introduction. The literary genre of Revelation is apocalyptic literature, is an apocalypse. And that genre began to appear in the 2nd century BC as a response to persecution and oppression. Authors, typically how an apocalypse would go is that authors would claim to be passing on heavenly mysteries revealed to them by angels or some other spiritual being. They were typically pseudonymous, which means that they were, they would write in the name of somebody else. So, maybe I might write a book as if I was Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln says this, that kind of a thing. So they would pick a historical figure and write in their name, although that person wasn't actually the one writing it. And so by projecting themselves into the past, the authors could then put historical surveys of God's dealings with his people and with the world in the form of prophecy. So in a sense, you're reflecting back, talking about how God is prophesying what's going to happen, but actually you're living in the time that's being prophesied about, and that's kind of how these apocalyptic types of literature worked. They use extensive symbolism, of course. Often there's a dualistic conception with this world and its sin and its rebellion to God and its persecution of God's people being contrasted with this day when God is going to intervene. It sees God breaking into our world, and so whereas as opposed to prophecy kind of looks for God's work kind of within what's within the course of history. Apocalypse sees God breaking in, his kingdom breaking in and being completely different. Now, there are similarities with apocalyptic literature that aren't exactly the same in Revelation. Obviously, Revelation is not written in the name of somebody else. We believe John wrote this, and there's very good evidence that John himself wrote it. So he's not writing, no one's writing this in the name of John. So in that sense, it differs from standard apocalyptic literature. Whereas many times Jewish apocalyptic writers would ground their hope in some future event, John grounds his hope in the fact that Jesus has already been the sacrificial lamb. He's already been slain, and so he's already won the victory. And so in that sense, he's not looking forward to some future event as much as seeing that victory has already been won. So it doesn't fit the mold exactly, but generally the picture that we get from Revelation is that of an apocalyptic style and how John writes it. Interestingly enough, with Revelation, we have very few or much fewer copies, Greek manuscripts that is, of Revelation, fewer than we do of the other books of the New Testament. It's not attested to as much as the other books. It doesn't mean that it's not, it just means that there were fewer manuscripts. When you think about interpreting Revelation, there are 4 basic methods of interpreting the material in Revelation. Of course, the first several chapters are letters to the churches, and those are pretty, they're straightforward and understandable. But when you get to more of the apocalyptic style and the imagery that goes along with that, there are basic 4 approaches. The preterist approach, or the contemporary historical approach, it sees that these visions grow out of and describe events in John's own day. So these are things that are actually happening in John's day, and that his purpose is to exhort his readers to remain faithful to Christ as they wait for God to deliver them into his eternal kingdom. So that's one way of looking at it. Another approach, called the historical approach, sees Revelation as a sketch of history from the time of Christ to our own day. And of course, this one's kind of interesting and almost humorous at times, because I know in my lifetime I have heard many different historical figures referred to as the beast in Revelation. And of course, times come and go, and events don't quite unfold the way that you might think based on Revelation. And so, but the historical approach would see that it actually provides this historical roadmap for what's going to happen from the time of Jesus until the end. The futurist approach views everything from chapter 4 to the end, finds its fulfillment in the very last days of human history. And then the idealist approach sees the symbolism being designed to help us understand God's person and ways with the world in a general way, and in the action of great principles. And this is the action of great principles and not a special incidents. So it's just kind of more just symbolic in that sense. And so all of these these are 4 different approaches, and you might read 4 different books that'll have 4 different approaches to interpreting the book of Revelation. Revelation adapts and modifies the apocalyptic perspective about eschatology, about the church. It is about eschatology. In other words, it's about end times, and it's not a history. Okay, so it's not describing to us everything, the play-by-play, what's going to happen in history from the time of Christ until He returns. But it is more about about the fact that God ultimately wins. And so, in describing the end, John does describe the end against the backdrop of what he is experiencing. So I would say that there's a combination of things going on in terms of approaches. He's combining it. It's set in his time, but he's looking at the future and what is going to happen, and the fact that in the end, God wins. So that gives you just a brief background. You have some more material there, obviously, in the book to read about Revelation, but I want to give you just a kind of a brief sort of interpretive background to the book of Revelation.